Deli sat back in her office chair, eyeing the clock that glowed softly against the dim light of her lab. The sterile, cold atmosphere of Vortex Inc. was her second home, or perhaps it should be considered her first home, since she spent more hours here than anywhere else. The only sound in the room was the click-clack of her keyboard and the occasional hum of the computer as she worked tirelessly through the night. Her phone buzzed on the desk, and she instinctively reached for it, her tired eyes narrowing at the screen. It was Zoe, her best friend, sending a voice message. "Yes, Wei." Zoe's voice echoed through the phone speaker. Deli smiled despite herself. Zoe had been planning a vacation for months, and it seemed like it was finally happening. "Leaving in half an hour, girl," Zoe continued. "I still need to pack." Deli chuckled. "How long will you be gone?" She tried to hide the surprise in her voice. "A few weeks," Zoe replied, a dreamy expression evident in her voice. "It's going to be amazing." "Sounds fun." Deli leaned back, allowing herself to enjoy the rare moment of freedom in her thoughts. "Enjoy yourself, Zoe. You deserve it." "You better believe I will." "And Deli, you better get out there sometime soon." "I swear, you work too much." Deli rolled her eyes, a small laugh escaping her lips. "I'll live vicariously through your trip. Don't worry." Zoe teased. "Don't work too long. Get out there. Maybe get a date, "Maybe next time," Deli muttered as the call ended. She returned to her work, the familiar sense of exhaustion creeping into her bones. Her eyes burned from staring at the screen too long, but she pushed through. Deli had always been driven. It wasn't that she loved her job at Vortex Inc. more than anything, but it was a distraction from the nagging feeling that she was missing out on something more personal, perhaps. But then there was the reality: cancer treatments, clinical trials, research. Those were the things that kept her mind busy at night. As she scrolled through a clinical paper, her phone buzzed again, a message from Ashton. She could already predict the content. "Ashton, you should have come out tonight, Deli. There are a lot of rich single guys here." Deli groaned and rolled her eyes. She didn't have time for this yet again. Ashton was trying to pull her into his glamorous life. Every time they talked, it felt like he was tempting her to abandon her work for a night of frivolous fun. A lifestyle she couldn't ever quite grasp. Sure, Ashton was her best friend. She had known him for years. But, for as long as she could remember, nothing ever seemed to change. He was always surrounded by beautiful women and a life of endless parties, while Deli worked tirelessly to carve out a future in research. "Ashton, there's a ton of fun to be had. Don't be a buzzkill." Deli sighed, her thumb hovering over her phone. She didn't want to sound bitter, but Ashton's lifestyle, his carefree attitude, seemed so at odds with her own. He could do whatever he wanted without ever worrying about the future. She typed a quick response. "Me, sorry, still at work." She wasn't lying. She was at work. She had a career that demanded her full attention. It wasn't glamorous, and she wasn't surrounded by a bunch of adoring fans. But it was hers. The problem wasn't that Ashton didn't care for her. It was that he didn't see her as anything more than a friend. Not that she could blame him. She had tried years ago to step beyond friendship. It had been a huge mistake, and one she wished she could forget. He'd never viewed her as anything else. Sometimes, Deli couldn't help but feel frustrated. There was a piece of her that wished he'd see her differently. Wished that for once, Ashton might be the one to realize she was more than the best friend he leaned on. She had been there for him through thick and thin. But it always felt like she was stuck on the sidelines. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her eyes. Maybe she was just tired. She couldn't keep doing this, pining over someone who would never see her the way she wanted. Her thoughts were interrupted by the shrill ring of her phone. It was Ashton again. "Ashton, I swear." Before she could finish, a foreign voice cut her off. "Miss Stevens?" The voice was heavy with a Spanish accent, thick and urgent. Deli froze. "Yes?" "This is Mr. Larson," he continued. "The supervisor at your apartment building." Deli's heart skipped a beat. "Mr. Larson? What's going on?" There was commotion in the background. Voices, sirens, a chaotic rush. "There's been a fire," Mr. Larson said, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm afraid all of your belongings. They've been destroyed." Deli's breath caught in her throat. "What? My belongings?" She blinked, trying to process the words. "What do you mean?" "There was a fire. The building. It's badly damaged. I just wanted to warn you before you came home," Mr. Larson explained. "You should check the news." Her hands were shaking as she searched for the local news report. The screen filled with images of her apartment building, black smoke billowing from the upper floors. Her mind went blank. Everything she owned, her clothes, her memories, Her books gone. No, she whispered to herself. Mr. Larson continued on, explaining that no one had been hurt, and that everyone was safe. The fire had started from a candle, a simple accident. But none of his words reached Delilah's ears anymore. She couldn't hear anything but the deafening silence that had settled over her. Miss Stevens? Mr. Larson's voice broke through the fog. I'll be there tomorrow, Deli replied, her throat tight. She was numb. She had no idea what to do next. What came after this? I wouldn't come tonight, Mr. Larson advised. The area is still being cleared, and the smoke is heavy. The fire isn't fully contained. Okay, she replied softly, her hands gripping the phone as though it might slip through her fingers. She hung up and stared at the screen for what felt like hours, her mind lost in a fog. She had no home to go to now. Her plans for the night, for the next few days, were erased in a heartbeat. In that moment, a memory flickered to the surface. That morning, she'd shared a quick elevator ride with Mrs. Moseley and her dog, Queen Glitz. The little dog with her over-the-top pink bow had always been a bright spot in Delilah's routine. Now that tiny dog had unwittingly set everything into motion. The building was gone, her apartment gone, and all the things she'd taken comfort in, her clothes, her books, her memories, were now ashes. But at least, she reminded herself, no one had been hurt. It was small comfort. But it was comfort. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Zoe. She hadn't packed yet, but her presence was a much-needed balm. In that moment, Deli knew she wasn't completely alone, not yet. Maybe things would get better. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to move on from this, together. Delilah had reached a point where she didn't know where to turn. All she wanted was to lean on someone who understood her, someone who could offer the support she desperately needed. Her thoughts immediately turned to Zoe. Zoe, the one person who always seemed to have it together. With her knack for fashion and impeccable taste, Delilah knew she could help her find clothes that actually fit her, especially after the upheaval she'd just faced. But as much as she longed for Zoe's advice and comfort, Delilah knew it wasn't meant to be. Not tonight. Not long before, Zoe had told her she'd be off on a quick vacation with her boyfriend Chase. They were headed somewhere warm and carefree, leaving Delilah to navigate her crisis alone. Not exactly the support system she needed in this moment. Her father's number popped up next, but the thought of calling him made her hesitate. He was protective, perhaps too much so, and his reaction to the fire would surely send him into a tailspin. She couldn't bear to add that kind of stress to her already overwhelming situation. Not yet. Maybe when she had a better grip on things, but not now. Then, there was Grandma Quinn, living far away in upstate New York. As much as Delilah loved her, the distance between them and the logistical challenges of getting to her weren't practical. And Aunt Lois? No, that was a no-go. The last thing Delilah wanted was to be under Lois's roof. That woman was known for being unpredictable, to put it mildly. And she wasn't exactly fond of Delilah's mother, who had passed away years ago. No way. Lizzie, another old friend, came to mind next. Lizzie was a dancer who had recently moved in with a new roommate and was juggling 2 jobs. Delilah had helped her move into a tiny apartment, and there was no way she could impose on Lizzie now. She had her own struggles to handle. That left only a few neighbors, but they were in the same boat as Delilah, unsure of what to do next, trying to figure out their own living situations. Even if she wanted to stay in a hotel, it wasn't a viable option for long. Everything seemed to be falling apart all at once. Delilah couldn't shake the feeling that she was stuck, with no way out. She buried her face in her hands, cursing herself for not having more people to rely on. Her thoughts kept circling back to the fire. Everything had happened so quickly. One moment, she was looking forward to a quiet evening at home, and the next, her apartment was gone. It still felt surreal. Mr. Larson's voice echoed in her mind, repeating the same words over and over. But somehow, each time they seemed less real. She pushed the thoughts aside and tried to think of someone else she could reach out to. There was one more option. Ashton. Ashton had always been there, ever since they were teenagers. He was her longtime friend, someone she trusted, someone she'd even had feelings for, though that was a whole other story. But now, in this moment of desperation, she couldn't afford to care about past crushes. He was the only one left who might be able to help. Her heart raced as she dug through the clutter on her desk, looking for her phone. Her mind felt like it was spinning, everything was so chaotic. And yet, she couldn't seem to focus long enough to get her bearings. After what felt like forever, she finally found her phone right where she had left it, in her hand. This was it. She had to call him. Her fingers trembled as she dialed his number and held the phone to her ear. If he didn't pick up, she was in real trouble. Ring. 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 Why wasn't he picking up? Ring. Ring. Pick up, please. Ring. Yeah? Ashton's voice came through, breathless, as though he had been interrupted in the middle of something. This is bad timing. Delilah let out a quiet sigh of relief. She had him. He was on the line. Ashton, she blurted, barely able to contain herself. Don't hang up. You won't believe what just happened, but my apartment. There's this little fluffy dog, Queen Glitz, and she knocked over a candle that set the curtains on fire. It was this big mess, and now everything's gone. Everything I own is gone, except for what I have on me. Can I crash at your place? Just for tonight? She said it all in one breath, rushing to get the words out before she could lose her nerve. Ashton didn't seem to immediately understand the gravity of the situation. His voice was strained, and there was a pause as if he were distracted by something. Deli? He seemed to be processing who was speaking. Wait, I didn't catch all of that. Queen Glitz? Oh, okay. Delilah couldn't help but groan, rolling her eyes. Of course, he wasn't paying attention. Why would he? It wasn't like her life had just burned to the ground or anything. Ashton, focus, she said, her patience thinning. My apartment is gone. The fire destroyed everything. Can I stay at your place? Please? There was a long pause. He grunted, and she could hear some noises in the background. Maybe he was working out great, just what she needed to deal with. Yeah, of course. You're always welcome here, he finally said, his voice slurring slightly. He sounded out of it, but at least he'd agreed. Delilah blinked in surprise. That was fast. Maybe too fast. But right now, she didn't have time to analyze it. Thanks, Ashton. You're a lifesaver. I'll be there in about 20 minutes. Yup, see you soon, Deli, he said, but the line went dead before he could finish her name. Delilah stared at the phone, wondering if she'd just made a huge mistake. Ashton wasn't exactly sober, but he was the only one she could rely on at this hour. She didn't have time to think about it too much. She stood up from her desk, her chair rolling backward into the cluttered desk behind her. Without thinking, she grabbed her jacket and bag, the last remaining thing she had. For once, she was glad she'd always carried such a large purse. It wasn't exactly a stylish accessory, but it held everything she had left in it: lip gloss, work badges, an apple, some random receipts, and a few stray mints. Nothing of true value, but it was hers. Delilah flashed her security badge across the card reader to exit the building, but before stepping out into the cold night air, she quickly ducked into the ladies' room to check herself in the mirror. Her long brown hair had gone from neat and tidy to a mess after a full day of work, so she took it down, shook it out, and finger-combed the curls back into some semblance of order. After a quick swipe of lip gloss, a dab of mascara, and a small adjustment of her slacks, she gave herself a final look in the mirror. Not bad, she muttered to herself. She couldn't afford to look too disheveled. Ashton's place was nice, and she wasn't about to show up looking like she'd just walked through a disaster. When she stepped outside, the streets of the city were quieter than usual. The night had settled in, and the world seemed to slow down, giving her the space to think, or at least try to. As the taxi whisked her away, she emptied the contents of her bag onto the back seat, taking stock of her situation. The thought of losing everything still felt surreal. Lip gloss. Check. Keys to an apartment that no longer existed. Check. A few random items: an old book, a magazine, an apple, and some cookies she hadn't even had time to eat. She was down to the basics now. But at least she had her health, right? And Ashton, for better or worse. When she glanced at the photos of her and Ashton, from when they were teenagers, memories of simpler times, when they had spent the day at Coney Island, she felt a pang in her chest. Those moments felt so distant now. It was hard to imagine that carefree girl, the one who had laughed without worry, when everything around her seemed to be falling apart. But maybe, just maybe, seeing Ashton tonight was exactly what she needed. He'd always been there for her, even when she hadn't realized how much she needed him. As the cab pulled up to his building, she steadied her breath. This wasn't going to be easy. But it was a start. Here we go, she whispered to herself as she stepped out of the cab. She was ready to face whatever came next. Ashton leaned against the doorframe, his eyes fixed on Nadine as she moved gracefully through the room, the hem of her dress swaying with each step. Her presence seemed to fill the space, her long blonde hair flowing like silk, and her tan legs accentuated by the red stiletto heels. He could feel his pulse quicken at the thought of the evening ahead, an evening with the kind of woman who was used to getting exactly what she wanted. Earlier, at the club's opening, he'd spotted her from across the room. A few drinks later, and here she was, about to step into his penthouse. Ashton had his usual routine for moments like this. It was a careful strategy that rarely failed, and tonight would be no exception. The lights were dimmed just enough to cast a soft glow over the space. He'd set the mood perfectly, with candles flickering and a bottle of red wine uncorked, ready to share. His favorite jazz records lined the shelves, offering a soothing soundtrack for the evening. He handed her a glass of wine as she lingered near the record collection, her eyes scanning the familiar titles. Prince. Marvin Gaye. He watched her, but his attention kept drifting back to the curve of her body, the subtle way her dress clung to her figure. Beautiful place, Nadine revictored, casting a quick glance around before turning back to face him. The smile she gave him was warm, almost flirtatious. Ashton raised his glass. It looks even better with you in it, he said smoothly, watching her reaction. She laughed, shaking her head slightly. Does that line work on all the girls? It only needs to work on one, he replied with a grin, his eyes locking onto hers. There was a moment of silence between them, a beat before she broke it with a sly smile. She arched an eyebrow. Cheesy, but it's charming. The night was still young, but the tension in the air was thickening. As they moved to the sofa, the conversation shifted from trivial topics to more personal ones. They were close now, her body almost pressed against his as they shared another glass of wine. Ashton could feel her legs brushing his, the silk of her garters just barely visible beneath the hem of her dress. She wasn't being subtle about her intentions, and neither was he. I've talked about myself all night, Nadine said, her voice a little lower now, her eyes lingering on him in a way that made the air feel warmer. Tell me about you. Your family. Do you have any siblings? Ashton took a sip of wine, his gaze drifting toward the window for a moment before he answered. I do. A younger brother, Raphael. We work together at our father's real estate firm. We're all close, the whole family. Her eyes widened, a knowing look crossing her face. Pattersons. You mean that Pattersons? The real estate mogul? He gave a modest shrug. That's the one. You've heard of us? Of course I have. Your company has been featured in Forbes a few times, right? Ashton couldn't help but smile at her reaction. He'd expected her to be impressed, most people were, when they found out who he was. He wasn't one to flaunt it, but it didn't hurt to let people know where he stood. Their chemistry was undeniable, and he could tell she was already thinking of the next step. With a hint of teasing in her voice, she leaned in slightly. I think I need to know more about you. Show me who you really are. Before he could respond, she shifted, her body drawing even closer to his. The conversation stopped as their eyes locked, and they both seemed to know where this was headed. The kiss was inevitable, electric, and soon, Nadine was straddling him on the sofa, her dress slipping higher as she pressed herself against him. Ashton's hands roamed, finding the smoothness of her skin beneath the fabric. She was bold, confident, and he couldn't help but be drawn to her. Nadine pulled away slightly, a mischievous glint in her eyes. She moved to the floor, kneeling in front of him, her hands reaching for the buttons of his trousers. Ashton leaned back, giving her space to take control of the moment. But before anything could progress further, the sound of his phone ringing shattered the intimacy. He groaned inwardly. The timing couldn't have been worse. Damn it, he muttered, reaching for the phone and answering quickly. Yeah? His voice was low, trying to hide the irritation bubbling beneath the surface. On the other end, a woman's voice began to speak rapidly, the words almost lost in the background noise. It sounded like a crisis, but Ashton couldn't focus on it. Nadine was still right there, and he was doing his best to ignore the temptation. Delay? He asked, trying to make sense of the conversation while Nadine continued her teasing. I need to talk to you about something. It's important, Dealey's voice came through the phone, her words distant but urgent. Ashton didn't have the patience for this right now. I'm kind of in the middle of something. Can it wait? But Dealey kept talking, oblivious to the distraction. Nadine's movements were becoming harder to ignore. Ashton groaned, trying his best to keep the conversation with Deli going while Nadine's hands worked their magic. Deli, I'll call you back. This is not the right time. But before he could end the call, the door to his penthouse slammed open, and Dilly appeared, her eyes wide with confusion. Ashton froze for a moment, his heart skipping a beat. He hadn't expected this. What's going on? Dilly asked, her voice sharp with concern. She took one look at Ashton, who was still standing in just his trousers, and then she glanced over at Nadine, who was hastily collecting her things. Nadine shot Ashton a look of disbelief. What the hell, Ashton? The situation had gone from bad to worse in a matter of seconds. Deli, seeing the tension, stepped further into the room, her gaze darting from Nadine to Ashton. I didn't mean to interrupt, she muttered, her tone filled with awkwardness. But you told me I could stay here. Ashton sighed, rubbing his temples in frustration. Dilly, this isn't… But before he could finish, Nadine stormed past him, tossing her jacket over her shoulder, the look on her face a mix of anger and disappointment. She didn't say another word as she slammed the door behind her. Dilly watched her go, a slight frown on her face. Am I interrupting something? Ashton could only offer a sheepish grin. You could say that. I'll just go, Dilly said softly, her shoulders slumping in defeat. I thought you'd be there for me, but clearly I was wrong. No. Wait, Ashton said quickly, his frustration giving way to concern. What happened? You don't just show up out of nowhere unless something's wrong. Dilly dropped her bag to the floor, her expression crumbling as she sat down on the couch. There was a fire in my apartment. Everything's gone. I didn't know where else to go. Ashton's heart sank. He had no idea. Shit, Dilly. I'm sorry. He turned, glancing briefly at the bedroom where Nadine had disappeared, then back at Dilly. Stay as long as you need to. We'll figure this out. Despite the chaos, Ashton knew there were more important things than his ruined night. The moment with Nadine was gone, but there was something about Dilly's distress that made everything else feel insignificant. As he reached for the phone to call someone for help, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just been thrown into a different kind of turmoil, one he hadn't seen coming. And it wasn't just the phone call that had ruined his night. It was the fact that sometimes life had a way of redirecting you, no matter how much you tried to stick to your plan. Ashton glanced over at Dilly, who was staring intently at the door. There was something in her eyes. Was it pain? He couldn't understand why she seemed so upset. Maybe it was the weight of everything that had happened. After all, she'd been through a lot. He'd watched her transform from a self-conscious, reserved woman to someone unafraid to stand her ground. She no longer needed his protection, but it wasn't always easy for him to let go of that urge to shield her. She was strong now, independent, and had come into her own.